Micah Lawson stood silently at the defendant's table, his hands folded tightly in front of him. His clothes were clean but plain, borrowed from the shelter where he slept last night. His eyes scanned the courtroom, not for support, but to remind himself that he still had the courage to be here. Around him, whispers filled the air like smoke. Spectators leaned in with smug certainty, shaking their heads as if the verdict had already been signed. A few snickered when they realized Micah had no lawyer beside him. He was alone. Again. At the bench sat Judge Brandt, a man with decades on the bench and a reputation for being quick to judgment. His expression was already sour. He glanced at Micah with tired eyes, his tone flat and impatient. The case seemed like another statistic. Young black man, criminal history, poor, unrepresented. What more was there to consider? The prosecutor, a well-groomed man in his 40s, spoke with theatrical confidence. He presented the security footage, grainy, but enough to see a man in a dark hoodie robbing a corner store. Same build, same height, same hoodie, he repeated to the jury, locking eyes with them like he was offering irrefutable evidence. And who was seen in that area, minutes later? Micah Lawson. Micah remained calm. His heart pounded, but he didn't flinch. He looked down at his notes, papers full of questions he wrote himself, details he had memorized over weeks from a public access law book at the shelter. He had no degree, no support team, just truth, and the weight of proving it to a room that didn't care. Every eye in the courtroom expected the same ending. They'd seen it too many times. A poor black man, a shaky alibi, a criminal past, a guilty verdict. No one asked how a kid who once stole food to survive could suddenly pull off an armed robbery like a professional. No one wondered why the store owner's description was vague, or why the timestamps on the footage hadn't been verified. Judge Brandt leaned forward, resting his chin on one hand, and sighed. He looked at Micah like a tired teacher addressing a stubborn student. "Son, this is open and shut. Just take the deal. Save us all the time." Micah looked up slowly, his voice steady but low. "I'm not guilty." The room paused. The judge's brow twitched, and just for a moment, the silence challenged the assumptions that had filled the air. Micah stood with his notes trembling slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from focus. The courtroom had shifted from its earlier snickers to a heavier, quieter curiosity. The store owner, an elderly man with fading memory but stern conviction, sat in the witness box. He had already pointed to Micah as the one who looked like him. That had been enough for most people. Micah approached slowly, no lawyer's rhythm in his step, just the weight of someone who knew the truth had to be earned, not gifted. He began his questions calmly. "Sir, how many cameras are in your store?" "3, the man answered. "And which one captured the robbery?" "The one above the register." Micah nodded. "That's the front-facing camera, correct?" "Yes." Micah looked at the printed screenshot in his hand. "Do you know the angle of that camera?" The witness shrugged. "No idea. It's just up there." Micah walked to the projection screen and pointed. "Would you say the lighting in this image is clear?" "It's good enough to see a hoodie and someone with a mask." "But not a face?" Micah asked, tilting his head. The judge interrupted. "Let's move along, Mr. Lawson." Micah exhaled and turned to the audience for a brief second, then continued. "When was this footage last time stamped?" The store owner hesitated. "It just runs on its own." "Do you update for daylight savings?" I don't know." Micah took out a piece of paper, hand-drawn, carefully measured. A rough map of the neighborhood. He placed it in front of the jury. "This is where the store is," he pointed. "And here," his finger moved 3 blocks down, "is the Grace Street soup kitchen." He looked directly at the jury now. "On the day of the robbery, I signed into that soup kitchen at 4:11 p.m. The footage says the robbery happened at 4:28 p.m. But the footage never adjusted for daylight savings. The actual time of the robbery was 5:28 p.m. That puts me 3 blocks away, in a room full of people, at the supposed time of the crime. There was a quiet in the room that hadn't existed before. The jury looked at one another. Some leaned forward. A woman in the back whispered something to the person beside her. Judge Brandt shifted slightly in his seat, one eyebrow raising for the first time since the trial began. He didn't speak, but he didn't scoff either. Micah stepped away from the stand, his voice steady. "You keep looking at me like I'm the answer to a question you already wrote down. But just because I look like the problem doesn't mean I caused it." The words echoed, not loud, but undeniable. And this time, no one in the gallery laughed. The courtroom was still. Final day, final words. And for most watching, the outcome felt like a formality. The jury had returned. The evidence, though thin, had been delivered. The prosecution stood tall with confidence that came not from truth, but from pattern. Micah Lawson was, in their view, already part of the system's rhythm. The prosecutor adjusted his tie, stepped forward, and began. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let's not pretend we haven't seen this before. A young man with a record, caught near the scene. The footage may not show his face, but we know how these things play out. This isn't just about a hoodie. It's about behavior. It's about someone shaped by his environment." He gestured toward Micah without needing to say more. The unspoken narrative hung in the air. This kid was born into guilt. When it was Micah's turn, the judge looked down at his notes, uninterested. The jury braced for another plea. The spectators waited for the predictable. Micah stood, hands trembling slightly, voice soft but clear. "I was arrested at 15 for stealing food, not money. Food. My mum was gone, my dad was gone, and my stomach had its own voice. I lived in a shelter for 3 years. I've never owned a gun, never robbed anyone. The only thing I've ever wanted was to feel full, warm, and seen." He paused, looking at the jury. "I got my GED behind bars, took classes from old textbooks. When I got out, the only place that would let me volunteer was the same soup kitchen that once fed me. I clean the floors there now, and on that day, when the footage says I robbed a store, I was sweeping spilled rice off a table. I signed the logbook. I smiled at a kid whose mum couldn't feed him. I was exactly where I used to be, but different." The judge looked up then, annoyed. "Mr. Lawson, this is not about redemption. This is about proof." Micah lowered his head respectfully. "I understand, Your Honor." He sat. The room went silent. The jury looked conflicted. The gallery looked bored. Another case nearing its end. Judge Brandt adjusted his robe, cleared his throat, and picked up his sentencing papers. "In light of the evidence presented and the testimony given, this court prepares to—" Micah shifted in his seat, gently raising a hand. "Your Honor, may I say just one thing before you finish?" Judge Brandt frowned. "You've said enough, Mr. Lawson." "Please," Micah replied, not with defiance, but with finality. "One sentence." There was something in his voice, not desperation, not emotion, just gravity. The judge narrowed his eyes, then nodded slightly. "One sentence." Micah stood, looked at the courtroom, at every person who had already buried him beneath their assumptions. Then, with a calm that silenced every shuffle, whisper, and breath in the room, he said, "If you believe I'm guilty just because I look like your worst fear, then this isn't justice. It's memory, dressed as law." The room went still. The words left Micah's mouth like a quiet storm. Not loud, not angry, just true. And in their truth, they shattered every wall of assumption that had been silently built around him. "If you believe I'm guilty just because I look like your worst fear, then this isn't justice. It's memory dressed as law." The room froze. You could hear the hum of the overhead lights, the faint shuffle of someone adjusting their coat. But no one spoke. No one moved. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keys, eyes wide. Judge Brandt sat motionless, his mouth slightly open, his fingers curled over the edge of the bench. That phrase, memory dressed as law, echoed like a slow, rising bell inside him. It wasn't just clever, it was a mirror, and what it reflected hit deeper than he expected. He was suddenly not in the courtroom anymore. He was back in a courthouse from nearly 30 years ago. Another young black man had stood in front of him. Different name, same tired eyes. He'd rushed that case, denied the motion to introduce new evidence, told the defendant, "You should be thankful I'm giving you the minimum sentence." Years later, the man was proven innocent through DNA evidence. By then, Judge Brandt had already moved on, promoted, honoured, respected. But some mistakes don't retire. They sit in the corners of rooms, in the pauses between words, waiting to remind you that power doesn't erase the past. Back in the present, his grip on the bench loosened. In the rear of the room, a young public defender named Clara watched with wide eyes. She had been silent for most of the trial, sitting there on a lunch break quietly observing. But now she scribbled something down on her yellow notepad in all caps. Memory dressed as law. She circled it 3 times. And from the far left bench, a man in a denim jacket, perhaps someone who had once sat on the other side of the courtroom wall, clapped once. Just once. It was awkward, uninvited, but real. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Judge Brandt finally straightened in his chair. His eyes scanned the courtroom, pausing on Micah, no longer just a defendant, but a man who had managed to pull truth out of thin air and hold it up in front of a blind system. He looked down at the sentencing form in front of him. The pen in his hand no longer felt appropriate. He cleared his throat. For the first time, his voice was soft, almost human. "This court," he paused, his voice cracked, ever so slightly. "This court will recess before final judgment." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Micah blinked, unsure of what he'd just done. The prosecutor's mouth was tight, but silent. The gallery, once so confident, was now visibly shaken. And Judge Brandt? He removed his glasses and stared down at his own reflection in the polished surface of the bench, like a man who had just heard the truth and could no longer pretend he didn't understand it. The walls of Judge Brandt's chambers, once lined with plaques, commendations, and framed degrees, now felt like silent judges themselves. He sat hunched at his desk, a legal pad blank in front of him, his gavel lying unused to the side. The echo of Micah's voice still lingered in his mind. Memory dressed as law. That phrase kept looping, unravelling something he hadn't dared to examine in years. He pulled open an old filing drawer and sifted through aging case files. One folder caught his eye. James Fuller, 1992. A different trial, a different boy, but the same pattern. Same age as Micah, same colour, same hoodie. He remembered how confident he had been in that verdict. No one had questioned the process back then. The defendant had cried, his mother had screamed, and Judge Brandt had just told her to sit down and let justice do its work. Years later, DNA proved the boy's innocence. Too late to undo the years he'd lost. Too late to undo what a courtroom had branded into his skin. He pushed the folder aside and sat back, staring at the ceiling. Micah's performance in court hadn't been perfect, but it had been real, focused, human. The way he questioned the angles of the store's security cameras, the way he had drawn that map by hand, the calm precision with which he had torn through a timeline most lawyers wouldn't have thought to double-check. It all came back now, in sharper focus. He pulled the timestamp printout closer. Slowly, methodically, he checked the daylight savings schedule for that year. He made notes. 4:28 p.m. video time. Daylight savings had kicked in 2 weeks earlier. That made it 5:28 p.m. real time. The soup kitchen login said 4:11 p.m. standard time. He wasn't lying. The door creaked open. A clerk, maybe 25, barely out of school, peeked in timidly. "Sir, I just wanted to say, that boy, Micah, he might actually be right." The judge didn't respond, just nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the paper. The clerk lingered a second, unsure whether to leave. Then he quietly backed out and shut the door behind him. Brandt leaned back in his chair and looked at the photograph that had always sat on the far corner of his desk. His son, smiling, clean-cut, in a crisp button-down shirt. 3 years ago, his boy had been pulled over for a DUI. The officer had let him go with a warning. Why? Because he looked like a college kid, the report said. Because he didn't seem like a threat. That phrase had once made him feel relieved. Now it made him nauseous. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of decades. He looked around the room, at all the law books, all the framed honours, and wondered how many verdicts had been written not in ink, but in assumption. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, he said the words he'd never admitted before. "This isn't justice. This is habit." The next morning, the courtroom felt different. Gone was the thick tension of certainty. In its place was something rarer: confusion, curiosity, and an odd silence that made people sit straighter than usual. Word had spread. Reporters packed the back row, their cameras already humming. People who hadn't cared yesterday suddenly showed up to watch. Micah sat at the defense table, alone as always, his hands clasped in his lap. He didn't know what to expect. He only knew he had nothing left to give. The one sentence he had spoken yesterday had not been planned. It had come from somewhere deeper than strategy. He thought maybe they would mock him for it. Instead, they had paused. Now they were all waiting. When Judge Brandt entered the courtroom, the bailiff's usual command, "All rise," rang out as a formality. But people rose with more attention this time, eyes locked on the man who looked changed. Brandt took his seat slowly, eyes sweeping the room. He didn't immediately look at Micah. He looked at the jury, then at the prosecution, and then down at the notes in front of him. Then he spoke, his voice quieter than before, but clearer. "Justice," he said, "is often described as blind." He paused. "But sometimes it forgets who it's looking at. Sometimes it memorizes patterns instead of reviewing facts, and that habit, when left unchecked, can be mistaken for truth." The courtroom was still. No one dared to shift in their seats. He continued, folding his hands. "Yesterday, Mr. Lawson said something that stayed with me. He said, 'This isn't justice, it's memory dressed as law.' That sentence made me reconsider everything I've heard in this courtroom. And last night, I did something unusual. I revisited the evidence myself. I reviewed timestamps. I verified locations. I made calls." He cleared his throat and leaned forward. "In doing so, I discovered there is reasonable doubt, more than enough to call into question the integrity of this case. In fact, I believe a full, independent reinvestigation is necessary before any ruling can be responsibly made." Gasps rang out across the room. Even the prosecutor flinched. The judge didn't flinch at all. He turned, finally, to Micah. "Mr. Lawson," he said, "you represented yourself with clarity, composure, and most importantly, truth. I cannot imagine the courage it took to stand here without counsel, surrounded by doubt. I can only say this. On behalf of this court," he took a breath, "I am sorry, deeply sorry, for how this process has treated you." Click, click. Cameras began snapping from the back. Murmurs spread like fire. Even the court clerk looked up, mouth slightly open. Micah sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the bench. Slowly, he blinked. His shoulders rose and then fell, like someone letting go of something they didn't realize they were still carrying. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. But he bowed his head, not in defeat, not in shame, but in something more sacred. A moment of recognition. For the first time in his life, someone with power had not just spoken to him, they had listened. Weeks passed, and the case that once seemed open and shut unraveled with stunning clarity. The prosecutor's confidence cracked as new evidence emerged. A routine investigation in another county led to the arrest of a man carrying the same weapon used in the robbery. Security footage from that town showed him, same build, same hoodie, but a face clearly different from Micah's. He confessed within hours, said nothing about Micah, didn't even know his name. Micah Lawson was officially cleared of all charges. The courtroom where he once stood alone now bore his name in whispered reverence. Reporters who hadn't looked twice before now called him the voice that shook the system. Commentators played his closing line over and over again across the internet. This isn't justice, it's memory dressed as law. It became a symbol, a challenge, a reminder of how much the law could forget. Judge Brandt, deeply moved and publicly changed, requested the State Judiciary Committee to form a bias and representation review board with a specific focus on cases involving self-representing defendants. What once would have been ignored was now taken seriously, thanks to the court's new spotlight. People called it bold, some called it overdue, but no one could deny it was needed. Meanwhile, in a small office near the courthouse, the young public defender who had quietly watched Micah's trial opened a free legal clinic. She named it the Lawson Project. Its mission, to defend those who couldn't afford lawyers and to train others in how to self-represent when no one else would. She hung a framed photo on the wall, Micah standing at the defense table, his hand raised slightly as he prepared to speak the sentence that changed everything. Micah, meanwhile, returned not to fame, but to what felt real, the soup kitchen. The same tables, the same spilled rice, the same tired faces looking for warmth and dignity. Only now, he didn't just serve meals, he mentored. On Saturdays, he hosted small circles with local teens. Some were quiet, some angry. Some wore the same hoodie he once wore, but all of them listened when he spoke. Because Micah didn't preach, he told stories, real ones, about being underestimated, about staying calm in chaos, about the strength of knowing who you are, even when no one else does. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, as he was wiping down tables, a man in a crisp grey suit walked into the soup kitchen. He introduced himself as an attorney from a non-profit law foundation. "We've been following your story," the man said. "The way you spoke, the way you thought. You don't belong behind a mop, you belong behind a bench." Micah raised an eyebrow, half smiling. "You offering me a job?" "Not yet," the man grinned. "We're offering you something better." He handed over a letter, stamped with an embossed seal. A full scholarship to law school. Micah stood motionless, the letter open in his hands, the soup kitchen quiet around him. The same space that once fed his hunger now fed his future. He looked out the window, toward the courthouse steeple in the distance. Maybe this time, the law would wear truth instead of memory. The sun beamed down gently over the university lawn, casting golden light across rows of black robes and fluttering tassels. Families filled every seat. Cameras flashed, music played. And at the center of it all, among hundreds of graduates, one man stood out. Not for his name or honors, but for the journey it took him to arrive. Micah Lawson stepped onto the stage, his suit crisp, his posture steady, his face calm. Gone were the shadows that once followed him into a courtroom. In their place stood a presence shaped not by revenge, but by purpose. As the dean called his name, applause broke out across the crowd. But in the far back row, one man stood quietly before anyone else. Judge Brandt. Older now, greyer, softer. His hands trembled slightly as he clapped. his eyes never leaving Micah. He had refused a seat of honor. He didn't want recognition. He only wanted to witness this moment. Micah reached the podium. The crowd quieted. He looked out at a sea of eager faces, some hopeful, some hardened, many unaware of what it truly meant to be silenced and then heard. He smiled just a little, then spoke into the mic. "Justice," he began, "isn't a building, and it's not a robe. It's not a bench, or a gavel, or even a degree." He paused. "Justice is a voice, and sometimes that voice doesn't shout. It doesn't echo through grand halls or wear perfect grammar. Sometimes justice is one sentence, the right one, at the right time." He looked directly at the crowd. "And sometimes that sentence isn't even spoken by a lawyer or a judge. Sometimes it comes from someone everyone already counted out." A hush spread across the crowd. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Micah lowered his gaze for a second, remembering the courtroom, the scoffs, the silence, the shame. Then he looked up again, steady. "I used to think the system was broken," he said. "Now I think it was asleep. And one sentence, just one, can wake it up." He stepped away from the podium. As he made his way down the steps, the faculty rose in applause. Families stood clapping and cheering. Cameras flashed. And then, from the back row, Judge Brandt stood. No camera caught him. No spotlight turned. But he raised his hand slowly and saluted. Micah saw it. Their eyes met for just a breath of a moment. No words were exchanged. None were needed. There was gratitude there, and closure, not just for the case they once shared, but for the transformation both had endured. Micah nodded in return and walked past the judge into the crowd of new lawyers, mentors, and future leaders. And as the sun rose higher and the voices rose louder, a final line settled like a quiet truth across the field. The judge thought it was over, but the law was just beginning to speak, for the first time, to everyone.